A man has been jailed for 5 years after officers located a loaded revolver whilst executing a search warrant in Luton. Terrell Ashton, 24 of Longmead, Houghton Regis, was sentenced at Luton Crown Court after pleading guilty to firearms offences. In August, Bedfordshire's Police Specialist Guns and Gangs Unit attended a flat in the Lee Grave area of Luton to execute a warrant as part of an unrelated investigation. Upon arrival, officers detained Mr. Ashton, as well as 2 men and a woman, and a search of a property was conducted. During the search, a firearm was located in a black bag. The weapon was later found to be a viable revolver containing 6 rounds of live ammunition. Detective Constable Burglar Swanee Powell, leading the investigation, said, "Thankfully, firearms-related incidents remain an isolated issue here in Bedfordshire, and every effort must and will be made to maintain that. Our specialist teams are regularly carrying out intelligence-led operations to apprehend those involved in serious violence. Since June, we've made over 100 arrests and seized 26 lethal weapons, including 5 firearms. We urge the public to continue telling us what they know about crime in their area through reports, and we can ensure people like Mr. Ashton are rooted out of our community." A man caught in Bedford town centre with phones showing he was involved in significant drug supply line has been jailed for 2 years and 3 months. CCTV footage showed Jackson Prescott dealing drugs including heroin and crack cocaine on the street of Bradford. Mr. Prescott, formerly of Cynthia Court, Bradford, was stopped by 2 officers on the 3rd of April this year. They discovered a burner phone and a small amount of cannabis. When the phone was downloaded by Bedfordshire police, there was a large number of messages offering to supply Class A drugs and using the name Rage. Then in May, Mr. Prescott was spotted by Bedfordshire Borough CCTV making a number of drug deals in the town centre. After an anonymous tip-off, Mr. Prescott was also found at the home of a vulnerable woman which was being used to sell drugs from. He was arrested and another phone was found, again being used for the supply of Class A. A drugs expert said Mr. Prescott was operating a significant deal line in the Bedford area, with the bagging likely to have taken place at his home. On Wednesday, at Huddington Crown Court, Mr. Prescott admitted 1 charge of being concerned in the supply of Class A drugs and 1 of being concerned in the supply of Class B drugs, and a further 3 charges of possession with intent to supply. He was sentenced to 2 years and 3 months in prison. Detective Constable Adam Geary of Bedfordshire's Police Specialist Gangs and Gun Unit said Mr. Prescott was involved in a very serious drug supply line. "We know the misery that sort of behaviour brings, both to the victims and to the wider public who are affected by antisocial behaviour that happens. So it is pleasing that he is now behind bars. These people prey on the most vulnerable in society through their drugs line, and we rely on the public to help us catch them." A man who exploited teenagers to help him run a major drugs line through Bedfordshire has been jailed for 3 years and 9 months. Malik Somerville, 20, was responsible for running the macro line and for the supply of drugs by the line. He was arrested following a warrant in Luton in June. During a subsequent search of a property, officers discovered 3 zombie knives, drugs, cash, and a number of phones, one of which was found to be connected to the macro line, and a handwritten list of customers. Mr. Somerville admitted being concerned in the supply of Class A drugs. The court heard he had recruited 2 16-year-old boys to act as runners, supporting the supply of drugs. In sentencing Mr. Somerville of Mepperhall, the judge said that he was careless and reckless as to his use of children, and said that it was an aggravating factor. Detective Inspector Scott Fowler of Bedfordshire Police Guns and Gang Unit said, "This was an excellent investigative work by our team to identify Mr. Somerville as a significant supplier of drugs within Luton, and then produce undefendable evidential case which led to an early guilty plea. County line gangs often use and exploit young people to help run these drug lines, as has been seen in this case. We're urging the public to help us tackle county lines and protect other vulnerable young people by being alert to the signs and reporting any suspicious activity in their area." 3 men involved in a plot to kidnap, blackmail and intimidate a man into handing over large amounts of cash have been jailed. Dominic Croucher, Jamie Williams and Paul Morrell all pleaded guilty to their part in a series of offences that occurred in Luton in September last year. That included trying to bundle a man into a van while he walked down the street, setting fire to his fence and garden shed, and sending threatening messages with photographs of his home and family. All 3 admitted conspiracy to kidnap and conspiracy to blackmail, and in total were jailed for more than 28 years at Luton Crown Court. Croucher, 28, of Penderry Road, Penland, Swansea, was sentenced to 8 years and 3 months, whilst Mr. Williams, 40, and Mr. Morrell, 39, both of Kentmere Drive, Doncaster, were sentenced to 10 years and 6 months. At around 7:40 p.m. on the 3rd of September 2023, the victim was walking in Havelock Road, Luton, when he was assaulted by Mr. Williams and another man and dragged to the ground. Mr. Williams also tried to handcuff him as he pulled him towards a white van already waiting nearby. The victim fought back and was able to escape before members of the public came to his aid. The white van immediately left the scene, but the handcuffs were left behind and seized by officers. DNA results linked the cuffs back to both Mr. Williams and Mr. Morrell. Using CCTV and ANPR, officers were able to identify Mr. Croucher as the driver of the white van, who had driven from Swansea the day before, staying in a hotel in Hemel Hempstead overnight. It was discovered that the number plate of the white van were changed after the attempted kidnapping incident and were located along with a key for the handcuffs at the home of Mr. Williams in Doncaster. Further inquiry showed that a white Mercedes rented by Mr. Morrell had been in convoy with the van after the attempted kidnapping. The vehicle was found to have travelled from Doncaster and had its number plates changed before arriving in Luton the same day. It is believed that Mr. Morrell directed Mr. Croucher to the victim's whereabouts. Days later, on September the 11th, the victim received threatening messages via social media to intimidate him into giving them some money that he had come into. Images were included which clearly showed the men had been watching both the victim and his family. The IP address was traced back to the address in Doncaster and the router was seized from the home address of Mr. Morrell. Later that same week, 2 people believed to be Mr. Williams and Mr. Morrell were seen at the victim's home in the early hours of the morning, dousing the fence with an accelerant before setting it on fire. Phone work showed all 3 were in contact with each other and several significant conversations where they discussed a long journey to say if they're stopped by the police, as well as alluding to life-changing money they would get. There are also images found which correspond to the ones used in the threatening messages to get the victim on social media, and a conversation where they claim to have blazed his gaff. Croucher and Mr. Williams were both arrested on September the 15th, and Mr. Morrell was arrested 3 days later on 18th of September. When sentencing, Her Honour Judge Hunter KC declared all 3 dangerous offenders and called their actions organised criminal activity. Detective Constable Daniel of Bedfordshire's Police Crime Investigation Department said, "This was an escalating series of events where the offenders attempted to kidnap the victim by using serious violence against him, and when that didn't work, they continued their vendetta by threatening him and setting his fence and shed on fire. Their intimidating and wicked actions left the victim in fear of not only his life, but the lives of his family too." Detectives from Bedfordshire Police's dedicated burglary team, Operation Maze, have helped put a prolific burglar behind bars. Graham Pinsent, 55, of no fixed address, was sentenced after admitting to 4 burglaries across Luton and Bedford. The Operation Maze team managed to identify Mr. Pinsent using CCTV sourced from near each of the scenes. He was arrested and later charged with 4 offences which took place in March. Mr. Pinsent initially struck at Lincoln Road, Shortstown, on March the 7th, stealing jewellery from a property. He then embarked on a burglary spree in Luton, targeting 2 houses on Villa Road and another on Hitchin Road, on consecutive days from the 24th to the 26th of March. Among items stolen were cash and electrical goods. He was sentenced at Luton Crown Court to a total of 4 years behind bars. Operation Maze's Detective Constable Jason Wheeler, who led the investigation, said, "Mr. Pinsent targeted properties and would steal sentimental items including jewellery, some of the items which have never been recovered. Burglary causes a great deal of distress for victims, so we will persist in our efforts to catch them. I'm glad I was able to identify Mr. Pinsent on CCTV in relation to each of the offences, giving him no option but to plead guilty to the charges put to him. A man has been sentenced to 21 years in prison after he carried out a terrifying and vengeful campaign on his ex-partner before stabbing her in broad daylight. On the 21st of May this year, Baz Faisal was arrested after he stabbed a woman in Dunstable Road, Luton. He had been waiting with a knife to attack his ex-partner after stalking her around the country. During the investigation, the victim told officers how Mr. Faisal had been coercive and controlling whilst she was in a relationship with him, and that she had been consumed with fear. She made several attempts to flee the relationship, however Mr. Faisal relentlessly pursued her. In August this year, Mr. Faisal, 29, of no fixed abode, pleaded guilty to attempted murder, threats to kill and stalking. He had previously pleaded guilty to possession of a bladed article. At a hearing at Luton Crown Court, he was sentenced to 21 years in prison, with a further 5 years on licence. Passing the sentence, Her Honour Judge Jane Hunter commented on the terrifying and vengeful campaign Mr. Faisal subjected his ex-partner to. She highlighted that the victim sought refuge around the country, where he repeatedly tracked her down, found her whereabouts and caused her to fear for her own safety, referring to him as high risk and of serious harm. Detective Superintendent Emma Pitts, head of Bedfordshire Police Public Protection Unit, said this was a horrific attack on a woman who was targeted in broad daylight by a man who refused to believe their relationship was over. During their relationship, the victim lived in fear, and even when she tried to leave the relationship, that fear followed her as Mr. Faisal continued to stalk and abuse her before carrying out his vicious attack. Domestic abuse and violence in any form is unacceptable, and we are committed to bringing perpetrators to justice. No woman ever deserves to feel unsafe, and they should be able to leave the relationship without fear. We understand how difficult it is for victims of domestic abuse to come forward, but we are here to help. We have a number of specialist trained officers who can support you through any criminal proceedings with respect and care, and we work with a number of partnership organisations who can offer guidance and stepping stones to help rebuild your future. A woman has spoken out about how the domestic abuse she experienced from a former partner has left her physically and emotionally scarred. The victim of Adrian Jones, 46, has talked about the impact of her abuse has had on her, that he was jailed for controlling and coercive behaviour and strangulation. Mr. Jones was arrested in October 2023 after threatening his ex-partner during an altercation where the police were called to an address in Bedford. During the altercation, Mr. Jones physically strangled the victim, leaving her unconscious and fearing for her life with severe injuries. Talking to officers, the victim disclosed that there was a long history of controlling behaviour which happened over a number of years. On many occasions, Mr. Jones would threaten her, going as far as to pick up knives to assault her. She disclosed that the manipulative nature of incidences escalated, especially once they had separated. Mr. Jones, of no fixed abode, was found guilty of controlling and coercive behaviour, intentional strangulation, and breaching a restraining order, and was sentenced at Luton Crown Court to 4 years in jail, plus a further 5 years on licence upon his release. He was also handed an unlimited time restraining order. In a personal statement from the victim, she describes her ordeal and trauma caused by Mr. Jones's actions. It read, "I am not the woman I once was. I am now a woman that bears the mental, physical, emotional and financial scars of abuse." She added, "This is a serious assault where I thought I could lose my life. There is without a doubt that Adrian did all that he did with intent to proceed to lie to the court." Detective Sergeant Darren Armitage from the Force's Domestic Abuse Team, Emerald, said, "There is no place for domestic abuse in society, and we are committed to bringing perpetrators to justice." Mr. Jones could not accept the relationship was over, and he showed no regard for his actions and the lifelong impact his actions have had on the victim. I would like to commend the victims for her immense bravery in working with officers throughout the investigation during the trial, where she had to relive her experience. I would also like to commend Victim Engagement Officer Carly Webb and DC Isabel Morris for their dedication to support the victim throughout the investigation. We know in Bedfordshire there are women who feel unsafe in their own homes, and they are living in fear. We have a dedicated team with specialist officers working alongside our partners who will work with victims every step of the way to ensure they are supported. We remain dedicated to making our country a hostile place for perpetrators of domestic abuse. If anyone's making you feel unsafe, we are here to help you when you are ready. It's never too late to report or come forward. A prolific shoplifter has been rearrested as he was released from prison and will now serve several more years behind bars. While Neil Stimson, 48, from Morder Avenue, Biggleswade, was being held in Bedford prison, officers identified him as being responsible for a string of shoplifting offences in the town during September. Mr. Stimson was due to be released after a month in prison, but as he was leaving, officers from Bedfordshire Police's Biggleswade community team were waiting for him. He was charged with 9 offences of stealing from shops and 1 of burglary. He was jailed for 4.5 months on the shoplifting offences and is awaiting sentence for the burglary offence. But the offences also triggered the second half of a previous 8-year sentence, so Mr. Stimson now faces almost 4.5 years in prison. Sergeant Sam Evans of Biggleswade's team said, "This was really good work by the team here. Firstly to identify Mr. Stimson, but then to secure the convictions in conjunction with our specialist burglary team. Mr. Stimson was expecting to walk free from Bedford prison, so it came as an unwanted surprise for him to find us at the prison gates. These convictions mean a regular offender will be off our street for many years." A drug dealer who exploited vulnerable people, forcing them to sell drugs on his behalf, has been jailed for more than 3 years. Memphis Phillips, 20, of No Fixed Abroad, ran a drugs line from London into Bedford. He recruited a network of vulnerable people and used them to take drugs from London into Bedford on his behalf. He was arrested on July 2023 when officers from Bedfordshire's Police Specialist Gangs and Guns Unit recognised him whilst out on proactive patrol. He was charged with being in concern of supply of both crack cocaine and heroin and was sentenced at Luton Crown Court to 3 years and 9 months in prison. Detective Constable Nima Bezadi said Mr. Phillips ruthlessly took advantage of vulnerable people, taking over their properties and using them as a base for his drugs line. In the process known as cuckooing, he would exploit other vulnerable people into carrying out his drug deals for him. While I'm pleased Mr. Phillips is now behind bars, where he can no longer cause any further harm, we know that there are still many others like him out there, causing misery to the lives of some of the most vulnerable people in society through their county lines networks. Our communities are the eyes and ears. If you notice that a house might be being used for drug supply, let us know. The signs to look out for include frequent visitors at unsocial hours, unusual smells coming from a property, suspicious vehicles outside the address, and any changes to vulnerable neighbours' routines. A man who confessed to killing his 74-year-old landlady before dismembering her and hiding her remains has been sentenced to life in prison. Scott Patterson, 45, had lived as a tenant in Annette Smith's home in Fairfield, Stowfold, for several years, but then began caring for her whilst she was recovering from a stroke. He suffocated her on the 8th of November last year, saying the demands of her care caused him to snap. After her murder, he dismembered her body and hid her remains in a storage unit in Letchworth. Patterson then posed as Annette, sending emails, gifts and cards to her family and friends in an attempt to further cover up his tracks and pretend she was still alive. Her relatives raised concern to the police and an investigation was launched by Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire and Hertfordshire Major Crime Unit in April. Mr. Patterson had initially told police that Annette had left their home with an unknown woman of her own accord. However, detectives discovered there had been no activity on her bank account and her passport and clothing were still at the home along with her laptop. They also found CCTV and records which showed Mr. Patterson had sold Annette's jewellery and other belongings for more than £5,000. Mr. Patterson, of no fixed address, was sentenced to a minimum term of 20 years imprisonment. At sentencing, Judge Justice Murray said, "You have been contemplating killing Annette Smith before you had finally killed her. This shows you had been thinking about and planning her death for some time. After you killed Annette Smith, you told elaborate lies." Detective Chief Inspector Katie Dunias, who led the investigation, said, "While in a position of trust, Mr. Patterson cruelly took advantage of Annette's vulnerabilities, which culminated in him not only ending her life, but taking abhorrent and deceptive steps to conceal his crimes. This was compounded by his efforts to make a financial gain by selling Annette's belongings. There is nothing that will ease the impact of this will have on those that knew Annette, but the hope is that today's sentencing provides some solace for her family and friends and puts an end to what has no doubt been an horrific ordeal for her loved ones." A tribute put together by Annette's family read, "We are totally heartbroken and devastated that Annette has been taken away from us in such a cruel and senseless way. She was a beautiful, caring and trusting, generous lady who meant so much to so many people. Annette, rest in peace with those who will love and take care of you."